In October 1847, in the limestone crypts beneath St. Bartholomew's Church in Boston's North End, construction workers discovered the remains of 37 children arranged in a perfect circle, their mouths frozen open in what appeared to be an eternal scream. The bodies, aged between 7 and 13 years old, had been missing for over 18 months, though the parish priest, Father Cornelius Blackwood, had conducted their funeral services and comforted their grieving families throughout that time. What the workers couldn't explain was why each child's throat contained a small silver bell, surgically implanted, or why the church's burial records for those years had been meticulously rewritten in Latin phrases that, when translated, formed an ancient summoning ritual. The most disturbing discovery would come 3 days later, when they realized the children had been buried alive, and that Father Blackwood's own journal, hidden behind a false wall, contained detailed instructions for what he called the sacred composition of innocence. But perhaps the most chilling question remained. If these were the children found in 1847, what happened to the other 63 whose names appeared in Blackwood's ledger? Before we continue with Father Blackwood's descent into ritualistic madness, if this story intrigues you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These historical mysteries have been buried in archives for a reason, and only the bravest among you, true mystery seekers who aren't afraid to peer into humanity's darkest corners, will want to follow this tale to its horrifying conclusion. I want to build our community of truth seekers, so tell us in the comments what state or city you're from. Has your hometown ever hidden a dark secret like this? You might be surprised how many of these stories exist, waiting in dusty church basements and forgotten archives, just beneath the surface of respectable society. Boston in the 1840s was a city of profound contradictions. With a population swelling past 115,000 souls, it had become the intellectual and spiritual capital of New England, home to abolitionists and transcendentalists, poets and preachers. The North End, where St. Bartholomew stood, was predominantly Irish Catholic, its narrow cobblestone streets echoing with the voices of recent immigrants fleeing the potato famine. These desperate families, clinging to their faith as their only comfort in a hostile new world, would pack into churches every Sunday, seeking solace from priests who represented their last connection to home. The neighborhood around Salem Street, where St. Bartholomew's cast its Gothic shadow, housed nearly 8,000 residents in conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Families of 8 or more crammed into single rooms. Children as young as 6 worked in the textile mills along the harbor. Disease swept through the tenements with seasonal regularity, cholera in summer, consumption in winter. Death was such a constant companion that the parish buried an average of 3 souls per week. Father Cornelius Blackwood had arrived at St. Bartholomew's in 1842, bearing impeccable credentials from the seminary of St. Sulpice in Paris. At 38 years old, he cut an impressive figure, tall, austere, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look through rather than at his parishioners. His sermons drew crowds from across the city. Even Protestant ministers, typically suspicious of Catholic clergy, praised his theological scholarship. The Archbishop himself had called Blackwood a beacon of enlightenment in these trying times. The parents of the North End trusted him implicitly. He established a school for immigrant children, teaching them English alongside catechism. He organized food distributions during the harsh winter of 1843. When scarlet fever struck in 1844, claiming dozens of young lives, Father Blackwood personally administered last rites, often staying with families through the night. His dedication seemed boundless, almost supernatural. No one questioned why he insisted on conducting special midnight masses for select children, those he claimed showed exceptional spiritual promise. No one wondered why these chosen ones, always the brightest, most beautiful children, began to change after attending his private sessions. Their parents, grateful that such an educated man took interest in their offspring, dismissed the children's increasing pallor and strange silences as signs of deep religious contemplation. Father Blackwood's public persona was meticulously crafted, a masterwork of ecclesiastical respectability that fooled even the most skeptical observers. He lived simply in the rectory, his only visible indulgence being an extensive library of theological texts in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Parishioners who visited found him perpetually studying, surrounded by candlelight and ancient volumes, the very image of scholarly devotion. His daily routine appeared saintly in its rigor. He rose at 4 a.m. for private prayer, conducted morning mass at 6, visited the sick throughout the day, taught evening classes, and retired late after hearing confessions. Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan, the church's longtime housekeeper, would later testify that she'd never seen him eat more than bread and water during Lent, and that he wore a hair shirt beneath his cassock, though she now wondered what else that garment might have concealed. The community revered him as more than a priest. He had become their protector against the Protestant majority's prejudices. When Know-Nothing gangs threatened Catholic families in 1845, Father Blackwood stood on the church steps, crucifix in hand, and faced them down with a sermon so powerful that even the mob leaders reportedly wept. The Boston Daily Advertiser called him a rare example of Catholic virtue in an age of sectarian strife. Yet there were signs, dismissed or explained away by those who witnessed them. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the district physician, noted that children who attended Blackwood's special sessions often developed unusual symptoms: persistent hoarseness, aversion to loud sounds, and what he described in his medical notes as an unnatural stillness of demeanor, as if listening to something others cannot hear. But in an era when children routinely died from mysterious ailments, these observations seemed hardly worth pursuing. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, himself Irish Catholic and devoted to St. Bartholomew's, would later admit he'd ignored reports of strange singing coming from the church at odd hours. "I thought it was the father practicing with the choir," he would testify. "The man had the voice of an angel himself. Who was I to question if he held rehearsals at midnight?" Even Marcus Whitman, the merchant who supplied the church with communion wine and candles, noticed peculiarities. Father Blackwood ordered 3 times the usual amount of candles, specifically requesting white wax, blessed by specific rites, that Whitman had never heard of in 40 years of serving Boston's churches. The priest paid in gold coins that seemed ancient, their markings worn but clearly not American or British currency. But Blackwood was such a good customer, paying promptly and generously, that Whitman kept his questions to himself. The children themselves gave the clearest warnings, had anyone truly listened. Young Timothy McBride, age 9, told his mother that Father Blackwood had taught them songs without words that made his throat burn. Catherine Kelly, 11, drew pictures of angels with too many mouths. Patrick Donnelly refused to enter the church after attending 3 special sessions, screaming that the walls were listening. But these were poor, traumatized children in a harsh world. Adults attributed their behavior to everything except the truth: the fever, the poverty, the difficulty of adjusting to American life. Father Blackwood, when consulted about these troubled youth, prescribed more prayer, more devotion, more private instruction. Parents, desperate for their children to succeed in this new world, gratefully accepted his guidance. The first crack in Father Blackwood's facade appeared in March 1846, when Mrs. Bridget Fitzgerald came to the church searching for her daughter, Mary, who had failed to return from evening prayers. The girl, 12 years old with a voice like a lark, had been selected for Blackwood's special choir just 2 weeks prior. The priest, maintaining his usual calm demeanor, insisted Mary had left with the other children after practice. But Mrs. Fitzgerald, possessed by maternal instinct, refused to leave. "I'll wait here until she returns," she declared, settling into a pew despite Father Blackwood's increasingly agitated suggestions that she search elsewhere. It was then that both heard it, a sound from beneath the church floor, so faint it might have been imagination. A child's voice singing without words, the melody unlike anything in Catholic liturgy. Mrs. Fitzgerald would later describe it as beautiful and terrible, like angels weeping. When she moved toward the sound, Father Blackwood physically blocked her path, claiming the crypts were under renovation and unsafe. Sheriff Brennan, summoned by Mrs. Fitzgerald's screams as Blackwood forcibly removed her from the church, initially sided with the priest. But something in the woman's terror, and perhaps something in Blackwood's too perfect composure, prompted him to return that night with 2 deputies. They found the entrance to the crypts sealed with new mortar, still damp. Father Blackwood claimed it was to prevent vagrants from desecrating the graves, but he couldn't explain why the work had been done without church authorization. The second incident came 2 weeks later. Dr. Hartwell was called to examine young James Murphy, who had collapsed during one of Blackwood's special masses. The boy's throat was so swollen he could barely breathe, and when Hartwell looked inside with his medical instruments, he found scarring consistent with repeated insertion of a foreign object. More disturbing still, the child's vocal cords showed signs of surgical modification, precise cuts that seemed intended to alter the voice's range and timbre. When questioned gently, James whispered that Father Blackwood had been preparing their voices for the great summoning. He spoke of a silver bell, blessed with oils that burned, placed in his throat during ceremonies in the church's lower chambers. The boy claimed there were others, many others, practicing for what the priest called the Nameless choir. Dr. Hartwell, a man of science struggling to reconcile these claims with reason, began his own investigation. He discovered that 37 children who had attended Blackwood's special sessions had died or disappeared over the past 18 months. In each case, Father Blackwood had presided over the funeral, providing death certificates that cited various common ailments: consumption, scarlet fever, accidents. The bodies, he claimed, had been interred in St. Bartholomew's crypts as acts of charity, since the families couldn't afford proper burial plots. But when Hartwell cross-referenced these deaths with city records, he found no corresponding reports from other physicians. Every single certificate bore only Blackwood's signature, despite regulations requiring secondary medical confirmation. More troubling still, several of the deceased children had been seen by witnesses days after their supposed deaths, walking with Father Blackwood toward the church at unusual hours, their movements described as mechanical and trance-like. The third discovery came from an unexpected source. Sister Agnes, an elderly nun who cleaned St. Bartholomew's, approached Dr. Hartwell in tears. She had found something while cleaning Father Blackwood's study, a book hidden beneath loose floorboards, bound in what appeared to be human skin. The text, written in a mixture of Latin, Aramaic, and symbols she couldn't identify, contained diagrams of human throats marked with surgical notations. One page, which she had managed to partially translate, spoke of harvesting the pure tones of innocence to breach the veil between worlds. It was this book that finally prompted official action. On the morning of October 15, 1847, Sheriff Brennan arrived at St. Bartholomew's with a warrant to search the premises. Father Blackwood was notably absent. He had supposedly traveled to Providence for a theological conference, though later investigations would find no such event had been scheduled. The search party descended into the crypts, breaking through the sealed entrance. The smell hit them first, not decay, but something else, something sweet and chemical, like flowers preserved in formaldehyde. As they ventured deeper, their torches illuminated a scene that would haunt each man for the rest of his days. The main crypt had been transformed into a ceremonial chamber. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, painted in what appeared to be a mixture of gold, dust, and blood. Candles, hundreds of them, had melted into grotesque formations. And in the center, arranged in a perfect circle, were the children. If this is giving you chills, you're not alone. What Sheriff Brennan and his men discovered in that crypt would fundamentally change how Boston, and perhaps all of America, understood the vulnerability of innocence to systematic evil. Before we descend further into this nightmare, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone brave enough to confront these dark truths. Let's discover together what happens next, but I warn you, what Father Blackwood had been attempting, what he nearly succeeded in accomplishing, will challenge everything you thought you knew about the limits of human depravity and the thin veil between our world and something far more ancient and terrible. The 37 children lay in their circle, each positioned precisely 3 feet from the next, their bodies preserved through some unknown process that left their skin with a waxy, translucent quality. They were dressed in white choir robes, pristine despite 18 months underground. Their mouths were indeed open, fixed in position by small silver devices that held their jaws apart at exact angles. Inside each throat, Deputy Collins could see the silver bells Mrs. Fitzgerald's daughter had described, delicate instruments surgically implanted behind the vocal cords. Dr. Hartwell's medical examination revealed the true sophistication of Blackwood's atrocities. Each child had undergone multiple surgeries over weeks or possibly months. The priest had systematically altered their vocal anatomy, creating what Hartwell described as human instruments. The silver bells were connected to the children's breathing passages through a complex system of tubes and valves. When air passed through, they would produce specific tones, each child tuned to a different pitch. But the most horrifying discovery came when Hartwell detected faint signs of life preservation. The children hadn't simply been murdered and arranged. They had been kept in a state between life and death through regular doses of a paralytic compound derived from fungi and certain exotic plants. Blackwood's journal, discovered behind the false wall, contained detailed notes on his experiments with these substances, purchased from Caribbean traders who asked no questions. The journal itself was a testament to systematic evil spanning 5 years. Written in multiple languages, often switching mid-sentence as if the author's mind struggled to contain what he was attempting, it revealed Father Blackwood's true purpose. He believed he had discovered references to something called the Nameless Choir, in texts dating back to the Library of Alexandria, a ritualistic practice where human voices, specifically those of innocence, could be used to harmonize with the frequency of the divine and open doorways to other realms. His entries grew increasingly frantic as he documented his process. March 3, 1846, the 7th child achieved the proper resonance today. When young Catherine sang the sequence I provided, the very air seemed to thicken. Objects in the room vibrated without being touched. This confirms my translation of the Damascus Codex. Innocence is not merely symbolic, but possesses actual metaphysical properties that can be harvested and amplified. May 15, 1846. The surgical modifications are improving. Dr. Maurizio's techniques from Venice, though condemned by the Church for creating castrati, serve a higher purpose here. The children feel no pain after the initial procedures. The compounds I've developed ensure they remain conscious but compliant. They even seem eager to please, to perfect their portions of the grand composition. August 2, 1846, 33 voices now. The harmonics they produce when singing together create visual distortions. Yesterday, during practice, I witnessed the walls of the crypt become transparent for several seconds. Beyond them, O glorious revelation, I glimpsed the outer sanctum described in the Babylonian texts. Beings of pure sound and mathematics waiting to pour through into our world, they sang back to us. The physical evidence supported these insane claims in disturbing ways. The walls of the crypt showed signs of extreme stress, cracks that radiated from a central point, as if tremendous pressure had been applied from within. Several of the stones had partially melted and resolidified in impossible patterns. Acoustic experts brought in months later would confirm that the chamber had been modified to amplify and focus sound waves in ways that shouldn't have been possible with 1840s technology. Among Blackwood's possessions, investigators found correspondence with a network of scholars and occultists across Europe and the Americas. Letters from a Professor Vaclav Cherny in Prague discussed harmonic configurations that breached dimensional membranes. A package from Haiti contained powders and tinctures labeled with instructions for maintaining the threshold state between animation and void. Most disturbing was a letter from someone signing themselves only as the conductor, praising Blackwood's progress and promising that, when the full choir of 100 achieves synchronization, the ancient listeners will finally hear our call. The 63 missing children from Blackwood's ledger were never found in the church. However, his notes suggested they had been successfully translated during earlier attempts at the ritual. He wrote of children who sang themselves into light and achieved unity with the fundamental frequency. Whether this was madness, murder, or something worse, investigators could never determine. Sheriff Brennan's report noted additional chambers branching off from the main crypt, but these had been sealed with a different substance, a black, glass-like material that no tool could penetrate. From behind these seals, witnesses swore they could hear singing, faint but constant, in voices that sounded young but spoke no earthly language. The Catholic Church ordered these chambers to remain sealed in perpetuity, though they refused to explain why. The investigation uncovered financial records showing that Blackwood had spent enormous sums, far exceeding his priest's salary, on rare books, chemical substances, and specialized medical equipment. The money came from a trust established in 1791 by someone named Mordecai Blackwood, possibly an ancestor, with the specific provision that funds be used for the continuation of the great work across generations. Perhaps most unsettling was a daguerreotype found in Blackwood's study, showing him standing with a group of children in the crypt. The image, though faded, clearly showed the 37 victims arranged in their circle. But the photograph was dated 1844, 2 full years before most of the children had even joined his special choir. How this was possible remained unexplained, though some suggested Blackwood had staged the photo with earlier victims as a template for his ultimate ritual. The deeper investigators delved into Father Blackwood's activities. The more they realized they had uncovered not just one madman's delusions, but a widespread conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of Boston society and beyond. Dr. Hartwell, now leading the medical investigation, discovered that several prominent physicians had been supplying Blackwood with surgical equipment and rare anatomical texts. Dr. Josiah Whitmore of Harvard Medical School had even provided preserved vocal cords from cadavers for theological research into the origins of speech. When confronted, Whitmore broke down and admitted that Blackwood had shown him things that defied medical science. During one demonstration, the priest had made a dead child's preserved larynx sing by exposing it to certain sound frequencies. The voice that emerged was beautiful beyond description, but wrong in every way, speaking words in languages that predated human civilization. Whitmore had become obsessed with understanding the phenomenon, willingly providing resources without questioning their ultimate purpose. The financial investigation led to even more disturbing revelations. The Bank of Boston's senior partner, Alderman Gregory Ashford, had personally managed accounts that funneled money to Blackwood from various sources. These included several prominent families who had lost children to fever over the past 5 years, families who continued making donations to the church even after their children's deaths. When pressed, these parents admitted that Blackwood had allowed them to visit their deceased children in special ceremonies, where they heard their voices singing from behind veiled alcoves. The comfort these sessions provided had bought their silence and continued support. Sheriff Brennan's investigation expanded beyond Boston when he received a telegram from the New York Metropolitan Police. A similar case had been discovered at St. Cecilia's Cathedral. 13 children found in underground chambers, their throats modified in the same manner. The priest there, Father Marcus Wynne, had disappeared 3 days before the discovery. Among his effects was correspondence with Blackwood dating back to 1841, discussing the proper harmonic intervals for piercing the veil, and mentioning other collaborators in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New Orleans. The network appeared to be international. The papal nuncio in Washington, when discreetly questioned, revealed that the Vatican had been investigating similar incidents across Europe for decades. A secret archive, he admitted, contained reports dating back to the 12th century of priests attempting to create angel choirs through manipulation of human children. The practice had been condemned and supposedly eradicated during the Counter-Reformation, but clearly it had survived in hidden circles. Sister Agnes, who had first brought the hidden book to authorities, provided crucial testimony under protection. She revealed that Blackwood had not worked alone in the church. Brother Francis, a young seminarian who served as church organist, had been his primary assistant. Francis had disappeared the same night as Blackwood, but Agnes had seen him leading groups of children into the crypts, playing specific sequences on a modified organ that seemed to induce trance states. She had found his quarters filled with mathematical equations relating musical frequencies to what he called dimensional harmonics. The investigation took a darker turn when Sheriff Brennan himself began receiving threats. Dead birds appeared on his doorstep with tiny silver bells sewn into their throats. His own children reported hearing singing outside their windows at night, young voices calling their names in harmonies that made them feel drowsy and compliant. The sheriff moved his family out of Boston, but the harassment continued, suggesting a network of conspirators still operating. Dr. Hartwell's research into the chemical compounds found in the crypt led him to a Chinese apothecary in Boston's small Chinatown district. The elderly proprietor, Lin Wei, initially refused to speak, but eventually revealed that Blackwood had been purchasing rare substances used in ancient Taoist alchemy, compounds meant to suspend the soul between life and death. Wei had sold to him reluctantly, sensing evil intent, but Blackwood had possessed knowledge of Chinese mystical traditions that few Westerners should have known. He had spoken of combining Eastern and Western esoteric practices to achieve something Wei called the singing death. More disturbing still were the testimonies of survivors, children who had attended Blackwood sessions but escaped the final fate. Margaret O'Brien, now 15, told investigators that the priest had made them drink a bitter tea that made everything seem distant and dreamlike. She remembered learning songs without words, just pure sound that seemed to come from deep within her chest. During one session, she claimed to have seen the ceiling of the crypt disappear, replaced by a swirling darkness filled with eyes and mouths. The other children had reached toward this vision, but Margaret had run, breaking whatever spell held her. Blackwood had let her go, telling her she was pitched wrong for the great harmony. Thomas Murphy, aged 13, corroborated Margaret's account and added his own horrifying details. He spoke of rehearsals where the children who had been fully prepared would sing from behind a curtain. Their voices were beautiful but no longer sounded human, more like instruments made of flesh. Once the curtain had fallen during practice, and Thomas saw the prepared children standing perfectly still, their mouths open impossibly wide, the silver bells in their throats glowing with a light that hurt to perceive. They didn't appear to see or hear anything anymore, existing only to produce their assigned tones. The Protestant establishment of Boston, initially eager to use the scandal against the Catholic Church, quickly suppressed their criticism when investigation revealed that several prominent Congregationalist ministers had been aware of strange activities at St. Bartholomew's. Reverend Jonathan Edwards III of Park Street Church admitted that he had heard the impossible singing during a nighttime walk past the Catholic Church, but had dismissed it as papist theatrics. Only now did he realize that his own church's crypts should perhaps be examined, as several children from his congregation had also disappeared over the years. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of this conspiracy, the investigation was about to reveal something that would shake Boston's understanding of its own history. The Blackwood family's involvement in these horrific practices went back further than anyone imagined, and what's more terrifying, they weren't finished. Please share this video before it's too late. These stories have a way of disappearing from the internet, and our true crime family needs to preserve this history. The more people who know about these events, the harder it becomes for similar horrors to hide in plain sight. The legal proceedings against the Blackwood conspiracy began in November 1847, but immediately faced unprecedented challenges. Father Cornelius Blackwood himself had vanished without a trace, though witnesses reported seeing him board a ship bound for Liverpool the night before the crypts were discovered. The British authorities claimed no such person had disembarked, but sailors from the vessel later testified that a passenger matching his description had thrown himself overboard mid-Atlantic during a storm, after being heard singing in his cabin for 3 straight days. The trial of the conspirators who remained became the most sensational legal proceeding in Boston's history. Dr. Whitmore and 3 other physicians were charged with accessory to murder, though their lawyers argued that no bodies showed traditional signs of violence. The children had been transformed, they claimed, not murdered, a defense that horrified the public but proved difficult to refute legally. The jury, faced with evidence that defied conventional understanding, ultimately convicted them of the lesser charge of grave robbing and medical malpractice. Alderman Ashford's financial crimes were easier to prove, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, he was found dead in his cell after only 3 months, his throat cut with surgical precision, a small silver bell placed where his larynx had been. The guards swore they had heard singing from his cell that night, but no one had entered or left. Brother Francis was never found, though reports surfaced years later of a young man matching his description establishing a revolutionary new conservatory in Buenos Aires, where street children were taught to sing in ways that supposedly transcended human limitation. The Argentine authorities investigated, but found only an empty building with acoustic modifications similar to those in St. Bartholomew's Crypt. The Catholic Church's response was swift but secretive. Archbishop John Hughes of New York personally oversaw the cleansing of St. Bartholomew's, a process that involved bringing in specialists from Rome who performed exorcism rites for 7 straight days. The church was then deconsecrated, demolished, and the ground salted. The official records stated it was due to structural instability, but workers on the demolition reported that certain stones seemed to resist breaking, and that singing could be heard from within the walls until the very last brick was removed. The 37 children found in the circle were given proper burials, but their families reported disturbing phenomena at the grave sites. Fresh flowers would wilt instantly when placed on the graves. Visitors heard faint singing on windless days. Most unsettling, other children claimed to see the deceased standing at their bedroom windows at night, mouths open as if singing, though no sound emerged. The 63 missing children from Blackwood's ledger remained unaccounted for, leading to the formation of a special investigative committee. Their findings, sealed for 50 years by court order, reportedly contained testimonies too disturbing for public consumption. One leaked excerpt mentioned discovering resonance chambers in abandoned buildings throughout Boston, where walls had been covered in the same symbols found in St. Bartholomew's Crypt. These chambers showed signs of recent use, though no bodies were found, only small piles of silver dust and what appeared to be melted bells. Several families fled Boston entirely after the trial, claiming they were being stalked by figures in black robes who sang outside their homes at night. The Fitzgerald family moved to California, but Mrs. Fitzgerald wrote back that her surviving children had begun singing in their sleep, the same wordless melodies their sister Mary had learned from Father Blackwood. The singing spread like a contagion through their new community, until the local priest performed a ritual of silence that left the children unable to speak for months. Dr. Hartwell, haunted by his investigations, dedicated his remaining years to researching the medical procedures Blackwood had performed. His posthumously published papers revealed that the throat modifications weren't just surgical, but involved introducing a symbiotic organism, possibly fungal, that continued to alter the vocal cords even after death. He theorized that the missing children hadn't died but had been translated into living sound, existing in frequencies beyond human perception. His colleagues dismissed this as the ravings of a man driven mad by trauma, but acoustic researchers in the 20th century would find his theories disturbingly prescient. The Bank of Boston's investigation revealed that the Blackwood Family Trust continued to operate, moving money to accounts in Switzerland, Italy, and Egypt. Attempts to freeze these assets failed when the banks claimed no such accounts existed, though investigators had seen the transfer records with their own eyes. The trust's executors were listed as the Eternal Choir, Incorporated, an entity registered in no earthly jurisdiction. Most disturbing was the discovery of a letter in Blackwood's effects, dated 1848, months after his supposed death. It was addressed to my successors in the great work and contained detailed instructions for resuming the project. The first attempt has ended in exposure but not failure. The 37 achieved partial resonance before interruption. Their voices continue the work in frequencies below human hearing. The 63 who successfully translated have established the foundation notes. When 144 voices join in perfect harmony, the door will open fully. I have seen what waits beyond, beings of pure music, mathematics made flesh, the true angels whose song created reality itself. They have promised us transformation, evolution beyond the crude matter of our current forms. The work continues. Listen for the singing. When you hear children's voices where no children should be, you will know we have begun again. The Blackwood case fundamentally altered how Boston and America understood the vulnerability of immigrant communities and the poor to systematic predation by those in positions of religious authority. The blind trust placed in clergy, particularly during times of social upheaval and displacement, had created perfect conditions for evil to flourish undetected. The case led to reforms requiring multiple witnesses for youth programs and mandatory reporting of unexplained child deaths, though these measures came too late for Blackwood's victims. What the case revealed about human nature was perhaps more disturbing than the crimes themselves. Dozens of adults had witnessed signs of abuse, but chose ignorance over investigation. The promise of comfort, whether spiritual or in Blackwood's perverse offering to let parents hear their dead children, had bought silence and complicity. The thin line between faith and delusion, between miracle and manipulation, had been exploited by someone who understood that desperate people will accept almost any explanation that offers hope. Modern psychologists studying the case files have noted parallels to contemporary trafficking rings and institutional abuse. The same patterns of grooming, the exploitation of poverty and desperation, the use of religious authority to silence questions. But the Blackwood case contained elements that defied conventional understanding. The acoustic modifications to the crypts, achieved with 1840s technology, shouldn't have been possible. The chemical compounds used to preserve the children in their threshold state between life and death preceded modern pharmacology by decades. The story was actively suppressed for over a century. The Catholic Church classified all documents related to the case, while Boston's secular authorities were equally eager to forget an incident that revealed their own failures. Families were paid to remain silent or relocated with the understanding that they would never speak of what they had experienced. The official history of St. Bartholomew's was rewritten to exclude any mention of Father Blackwood or the events of 1847. It was only in 1997, when construction workers renovating a brownstone in the North End broke through a wall and discovered one of Blackwood's secondary chambers, that the story began to resurface. Inside, they found 13 small skeletons arranged in a semicircle, their throats containing the same silver bells. But these children showed signs of having died much more recently, perhaps within the last 50 years. The chamber's walls were covered in fresh writing, multiple hands documenting dates and names. Timothy sings with us now 1952. Margaret achieved resonance 1967. The choir grows 1981. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators have since claimed to find similar chambers in cities across America, always in the oldest churches, always sealed but showing signs of recent entry. The Catholic Church denies any knowledge of these discoveries, but several whistleblowers have suggested that a secret order exists within the Vatican, dedicated to finding and sealing these resonance points before they can be activated. So I leave you with this thought-provoking question. If Father Blackwood's conspiracy was truly stopped in 1847, why do children continue to disappear near old churches in Boston? Why do acoustic engineers find impossible sound modifications in buildings that predate modern technology? And why, if you stand very still in certain crypts on quiet nights, can you still hear the faint sound of children singing songs without words? What do you think really happened? Was Blackwood simply a madman who convinced others to share his delusion, or did he discover something real, something that powerful institutions still work to suppress? Share your theories in the comments below, but be careful. Sometimes, seeking the truth about these old mysteries attracts attention from those who prefer them buried. If you've made it this far, you're truly one of the brave ones. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. We'll be exploring the tunnels beneath Salem, where similar silver bells have been discovered, and where local children report dreams of singing in languages they don't understand. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey into America's hidden history. Remember, these stories aren't just about the past. They're warnings about what happens when authority goes unquestioned, when desperation meets exploitation, and when we refuse to listen to the most vulnerable among us. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and above all, listen carefully to the children in your life. Their songs might be trying to tell you something. Until next time, this is your guide to the darkness humanity tries to forget. Keep seeking the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. And if you hear children singing where no children should be, run.